just start with the most important thing. So obviously thank Megan and Lucy and the rest of the Attest team for having us here today, and thank all of you for gracing us with your presence. So why are we here? We're here to talk about brand storytelling. But what is storytelling? What is all the fuss? So when I started my career in Poland in the 1990s, it was all about PR. Then it was rebranded as communications. Now we're all here talking about storytelling, and actually I'm head of storytelling. And it's actually interesting to think about, why storytelling? Why is this in vogue right now? I think it's just useful to remind ourselves of the world we're in, because I think it really puts it into context. Why are we all focused on stories? And I think, if we think about the last 3 decades since the dawn of the internet, there've been some massive changes. A change to the way we live and work, obviously, but also crucially how we communicate. And the whole what we call information ecosystem has changed radically. So in the previous years, you pretty much had truth, which was dictated by those in positions of power, right? But because of the internet, information has been what we can call disintermediated. So these guys, who used to be what we call the dictators of truth, are pretty much vanished, right? We're no longer interested to receive our information from these dictators of truth. We no longer have one centrally controlled version of events. Propaganda, which used to be the reality in many realities, has pretty much disappeared, and it's become much more distributed. So to some extent, it still exists, but its form is a lot harder to recognize. And because people have similar beliefs and interests right now, we can start to see the emergence of what we might call global tribalism, and the sense that people of similar interests and beliefs, connected by the internet, kind of feel this affinity and connection with one another, and therefore kind of start to operate as a tribe. And you can kind of think of this movie Avatar, which is a sci-fi movie, but in the future, people go back to believing in tribes and feeling connected with Mother Nature. And I think that's a really interesting concept. And I think that is something to do with why storytelling has come back into vogue, right? Because right now we're much more interested to hear information through a narrative, through a story, not through these dictators of truth that I talked about earlier on. So these tribes right now are our audiences, and they're interested in these ancient forms of communication, what we can call unadulterated content. And I think the point is that these tribes are much more savvy today about what's going on in the world, and I mean what's going on in the world everywhere, always, right? That's also why in this day and age, there's much more focus on talking about purpose and talking about saving the planet, or caring about the Australian wildfires, because we all know it's happening. So therefore, we're expected to feel a certain sense of responsibility about it as members of these tribes, but also as companies. So there's an enormous focus right now on purpose, and I think that's an important part of storytelling. So that's going on. People are more responsible than ever before. They want their information. Kind of straight from the horse's mouth, right? So they want to feel that they're getting it straight. They're not getting it through some other channel. They also want to feel that it's authentic and it's come from the original source, which is this why I've got this piece of Parmesan here. And I think work that one out. But and then I think another really important point to remember, if you're telling a story, is that these days people don't want this beautiful, polished story where they can't see the edges. People want to see inside the whole process of making the story, right? So they want to see inside the black box, and I think that's a really important point for us to remember, right? So we're not looking for perfect, polished content anymore. Our audiences just want to see how we've made the content, right? How has it been constructed? And I think a really important thing with storytelling, finally, here, is that if you're a content producer these days, you have to think of yourself being, in a marathon of millions of other content producers, right? So the competition is enormous. So and the competition these days is not just other companies; it's also it's also our audiences, it's also our partners, individuals. Everyone is producing content, and all of that is competitive to the stuff we're doing. So content has to be good, right? So you can't just make a cool video and expect people to watch it. They won't, unfortunately. And I think certainly I work for IBM. We're tempted to make content all the time. We don't always think, is anyone really going to watch this, right? Is anyone interested in it? And I think that's really, really important, because you can spend £100,000 on a piece of content, and it's not going to go anywhere. So I think it's really important to think about competition. So just a couple of points before we open out to the rest of the audience. I figured it would be useful just to think about what we can take from, if we're talking about stories, what can we take from the movie industry or the screenplay industry? What are the kind of a few lessons that we can think about when we're going about constructing a story? And I don't know whether you guys have come across this concept of story physics, which I think is a really interesting way to think about stories, and good for all of us in the area of corporate storytelling. There's a guy called John York, and he's a drama expert. I don't know whether you've come across him. He used to work on EastEnders and as an advisor on Channel 4. He's done some very good lectures on storytelling, which you can find on YouTube, so take a look. And the concept here is that in a really great story, you have this thing called story physics. And story physics is pretty much a drama or a tension created by a struggle of difference and opposites and characters. So obviously the ancient idea of good versus evil is part of this. But then you have, if you take pretty much every successful movie, you see this. So you have this innocent and poor clownfish in Finding Nemo who gets catapulted into this kind of dangerous world on land, the 21st century, and the hustle and bustle, and this screaming kid called, who remembers the name of this kid? Dala, something like that. Yeah. So you have this tension, this struggle. Can this poor Nemo survive, and will his father find him? It's classic struggle. And then you get, if you take The Social Network, you get, geeky Zuckerberg thrown into a struggle with the corporate world, represented by these Winklevoss twins. Or you take Lord of the Rings, you get this undersized, dwarf who goes on a mission to destroy a ring against this overwhelmingly powerful character in Sauron. And then I think Breaking Bad is quite cool, because you also have this play of opposites, but often you have opposites within the same character, right? So it's not just different characters. So at the beginning of the film, you have Walt the teacher, this underachieving science teacher who becomes a major player in the crystal meth industry, and that creates, these opposites create a tension, and this is how most stories and most successful dramas are based. And I think in the corporate world, we need to remember these basic principles. We often forget, but we think about, when we try and make a story, we often have typically predictable, pretty slick characters, and we don't want any conflict. We don't want any. We're kind of frightened of risk and drama. We don't want an enemy. And these are the elements that all successful stories are built on. So I think it's worth thinking about that when you're making a story. So just a few words, and then we'll break it up into the panel. So how do you tell a successful story? I'd say one of the first things to do is to have a guiding star, and to work out, what is your truth, what is your purpose, and what is your relevance to the world, right? Ultimately, where are you trying to get to? Because if you're going to do successful storytelling, you really need to kind of play with things, break things up, change the format, change the way you doing things. And if you don't have your guiding principle in terms of who you are and what you do, as a brand, you're going to get lost, right? And then once you figure that out, I think it's about embrace difference, like look for quirky, unconventional characters, ways of telling the stories, strange micro stories which kind of might not be obviously connected with your main story, but you could build it into your narrative. Another thing I think we all need to try and do is get out of the office, like speak to people in our companies, in our customers, in our partners, people we know, and use this as part of your thought process. And then I think a lot of people do this already, like tell the story collaboratively, so it's not just your CEO, like telling different chapters of the story each week. People from across the organization, from across the entire ecosystem, tell the story collaboratively. And then really important thing to do is to constantly play with the format, right? Just because it worked last year or in the last part of your story, it doesn't mean it's going to work this time. Constantly break things up, turn things on its head. Really important point. If you go back to that previous slide, you remember that all of those characters in there had an imperfection or a weakness, right? They had a flaw, a central flaw. Nemo, I don't really remember whether you remember, he had one fin much shorter than the other fin, right? He had one big fin, one small fin. Walt in Breaking Bad has cancer, right? All characters in major successful movies have a problem, have a weakness, and through the course of the story, they overcome their problem in order to succeed. In corporations, when we try and tell these kind of stories with weakness and imperfection, there's something that a lot of people are frightened of because corporations don't like to be weak. They don't like to have an imperfection. But as storytellers, we need to help advise our leaders and executives that actually having an imperfection or a weakness can actually be very good for telling a good story. And then just two final points before I close. So allow the story to evolve. So the sense of a story arc. In my company, if we want to tell a story, the temptation of our executives is to tell the entire story in like a dumpster truck, all in one go, right? You chuck everything in your dumper truck and kind of dump it out, and there it is. There's our story. That's not really going to work from a story arc perspective. You need to think about, there might be micro stories that you can do that with, but typically you need to think about the entire cycle of the story. But then, like we were talking about earlier, even if you're going to try and do that, you need to think about, well, has my audience seen the previous episode of my story and the one before that? Probably not, right? Not unless you're Netflix, right? So if you are creating corporate content, have an arc, but then don't assume your audience has watched the previous version, right? So you constantly need to be on your toes, thinking, does this element of my story stand on its own? And then I guess the final point is just surprise, surprise, surprise. Just if you have a feeling in your content that you've seen this before, or if your audience might think, I've seen this before, it's probably not going to be a very successful piece of content and probably not going to be a very successful story. So constantly reinvent. And I think if you can do all this, and it sounds relatively easy, then I think you're onto something. The reality is, though, when we work for companies and brands, doing this is very, very hard because the executives you work for in a company are looking for consistency. They're looking for low risk, but I think it's often very useful to have these things in mind and really think about what is storytelling, right? And take a few lessons from the best storytellers and the movie makers, because I think if we do that, we're onto something good.